What's good, y'all? It's your boy, Copper Kid, back with another episode of The Observation. This time we have an interesting video from um the organization called the Jude 3 Project. And what essentially the Jude 3 Project is it's a cohort of various theologists, historians, ministers, preachers, pastors who are of predominantly African American origins or African origins. And they put together this cohort of continuing education and theology and apologetics surrounding the Bible and surrounding Christianity and the followers of Jesus, but through an Afrocentric lens. And I came across it, thought it was really provoking content, thought provoking content, courageous conversations, as is the series from this panel session. But what I want to point out is the diverse set of expertises on this panel. You have the moderator, who I'm not sure his credentials, but surrounding him are four doctors in very varying set of expertises, which is really awesome to see. I took a look at some of this. I actually watched the whole session, this particular session at this event. And it was really cool. And I learned a lot of stuff, so I wanted to bring it to the forefront. But this episode specifically is about rediscovering early African Christianity. So without further ado, we can jump right in. But I do want to point out Jude 3, since they are called the Jude 3 Project, a lot their mission is centered around that verse of the Bible. So let me jump to Jude 3 quickly, just to see, so you guys can have some context as to the purpose of their organization and what they aim to do and where they put their money, time, and effort and expertise in. So, Jude 3 reads, "Dear friends, although I was very eager to write to you about the salvation we share, I felt compelled to write and urge you to contend for the faith that was once for all entrusted to God's holy people." So, it's interesting that, they're talking about Jude 3 as the backbone of their mission to contend for the faith that was once for all entrusted to God's holy people. So just some context into this session, rediscovering early African Christianity. Some of the topics that they discuss are about the importance of early African Christianity, which you'll hear about, recovering Pan-Africanism and rediscovering that within the context of Christianity, the Black and urban departure from the church, and then the difference between slave trade racism and modern racism. So all these professors come with a different expertise, but to me it's interesting. One of them notes early on, when John looked up, he saw every nation, tribe, and tongue. That's a quote from Revelation. So when John looked up and he was getting this revelation in the final book of the Bible, he saw every nation, tribe, and tongue. So I think I really, really resonate with their mission. And something that we often hear is that Christianity is the religion of our slave masters or our colonizers. But through history, through theology, and through the Bible itself, we see that that is not the case. In fact, the earliest Christians were in Africa before Christianity became a state religion of Rome in around the year 300. So, as one of these brothers states, There's always been a black person testifying to the word of Jesus as long as time has been around. So we must not subscribe to the false history that Christianity is a slave master religion and a colonizer's religion. As the youth, as you know, as a young person and as someone who is half African, it's really important to me that we understand that and that we don't get misguided and pushed away from the Bible due to false history, but also due to the internal whitewashing of Christianity, to our own Christian forefathers leaving out some of the most important aspects of African Christianity that often the early European church relied on. They'll talk about it. During the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther actually relied on an Ethiopian priest to come tell him how they practice the faith and what their customs are to ensure that they are abiding by the faith. That was during the 1500s. So there's clearly a gap in history from our Christian knowledge and our American Christian knowledge. So this is a really insightful podcast. We'll just watch, or this is an insightful session, sorry. So we'll just watch the first 20 minutes of it and reflect back at the end. But I hope you guys enjoy this. If you watch it, like, comment, subscribe. Turn on post notifications if you enjoy this type of content and if you enjoy the dialogue that is being shared. But without further ado, let's jump right in.
Afternoon to everyone here and to our virtual audience. We're excited about this conference, Reclaiming Christianity. Before we dive into the panel, I want to give you another reminder about being able to text in your questions using the QR code or the link. Go to www.pigeonhole.at and use the code CC21. That code again is CC21. We're going to dive right in because this is a very important topic because it has evangelistic effects when we think about how Africa is either whitewashed or ignored as it relates to the rich African history of Christianity long before the transatlantic slave trade. Dr. Bantu, I want to start with you. You wrote a book called Gospel Hamanot, and in it you said, Ethiopian theological literature as the concept of right or orthodox theology was of utmost importance to ancient Christians of the African continent. I want all of you to take a stab at it, but I want to start with you, Dr. Bantu. Why is it important to rediscover early African Christianity?
Yeah, that's a great question, Pastor Gay. I mean, I would say just to jump it off that it's important maybe for two reasons. Number one, because God made us black on purpose, and He made all of us the way He made us intentionally. So sometimes we might think that racial or ethnic or cultural distinctions are some kind of just temporary reality, and I think sometimes we subconsciously think that when we get to heaven, we're all just going to be the same. But when John looked up, he saw every nation, tribe, and tongue, and so our diversity in the creation mandate, God said, fill the earth and cultivate it. And so He intended for diversity, and that includes blackness. So it's a beautiful thing, and it should be celebrated and known. But the second reason is because specifically black people, black history, black civilizations have been specifically targeted, and especially within Christianity, Christianity has even been perverted and weaponized against to terrorize black people. So it's even more important in the writing of Paul in 1 Corinthians 12 to give greater honor to the parts of the body that have lacked it, and to especially emphasize the contributions that Africans have made in Christianity since day one.
Awesome. Dr. McCollum?
Hello? Oh, I think that on a basic level, it's always important to counter a lie with the truth.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot of people who are served by making the history of Christianity white. And if you grow up, at least what I did, in a black context, there's always been kind of like the black nationalist tradition in Christianity, the secular national tradition, that has said, well, you became a Christian just because of the slave trade, and the history of blackness in Africa was Muslim or was not Christian. And so I just want to say, sometimes we have to be honest about what we're going to recover. So if part of what's happening in our day is a recovery of the history of Africa, and we want to kind of adopt this Pan-Africanism. Well, I said, if you're going to go with Pan-Africanism and adopt the history of Christianity, adopt the history of Africa as a part of recovering black culture in America, then you got to recover the Christian part too. And so you can't just, if you're going to take Egypt, you got to take Christian Egypt. And so what I want to say is the first thing you got to do is to tell the truth about what happened. That doesn't solve all the problems, but that's one thing. So it's important to recover it for the sake of a realistic reckoning of what does it mean to recover my African heritage. Because as far back as you can go, there's some black guy yelling Christ is risen. And this is just true. So but on the other side, a lot of times the discourse, especially in some white, I'll say some, so people won't say I said all, some white Christian spaces, there's this idea that when they talk about diversity, they're inviting the people of color in like it's theirs. But like they're not inviting us in, we were here too. And so the important part is to say, I'm not being invited to a party that you threw. Jesus threw the party. Absolutely. And we were always eating at the table from the beginning. And so both as it relates to dealing with kind of black nationalism that calls Christianity a whitewashed religion, and to look at white portions of Christianity that want to pretend as if we can only be invited if we meet their standards. And we had to say, no, y'all don't get to set the standards. God set those standards. And that's the reason why I think it's important to recover all of our history.
Yeah, that's so important. We know that Martin Luther, a lot of times we start church history at the Reformation in Wittenberg, but there were centuries of African Christianity that preceded the Protestant Reformation. In fact, Luther got a lot of his theology from Ethiopian Christians, but they don't teach us that. Dr. Waller, as a pastor of a large church and just understand evangelism, can you expound on this? Why is it important to rediscover early African Christianity?
Well, again, thank you for letting me be a part of this conversation. And I agree with my brother, first of all, because it's the truth. And just telling the truth about our faith is important to recover our faith and to help our community embrace the faith. Then secondly, it's important because we normalize the conversation and not trivialize the conversation. I'm a little older up here, and so, you know, when those that are just a little older than I am came back in the late 60s to the church saying, we've got some questions that y'all can't answer, there was a departure out of the church. And that departure was black men, and in many cases, educated, just sort of said the church is not ready to answer these questions. Cornel West says in 1987, there was sort of a resurgence of the Pan-African movement, those of us who began to raise the question, how can we be black and Christian? And then there was the trivializing of it, and so we were all doing the finding blacks in the Bible stuff. But the truth of the matter is, finding blacks in the Bible isn't the hard thing. If you want a real academic pursuit, find some white folk. I mean, that's the real academic pursuit. And so we have to change the conversation. It's our book. It's our story. We're not a meta-narrative, we are the narrative. And so it's important because if you're going to then do evangelism in an urban context, then there are people raising the question, why does your God not look like us? And those of us now, the whole world has access to our library. So we can't hide behind lies any longer. We can't pretend like people can't find out this stuff. And if we who sit in the pulpit or we who claim to be doctors and so forth are not willing to tell the truth, we're going to lose another generation of people.
Dr. Daniels.
So my period I focus on is the 1400s, 1500s, and 1600s. And one of the things we need to realize is that the slave trade was traumatic. It was horrific. But we're not merely living in the afterlives of slave trade. We're living in the midst of the rise of modern racism. And so I argue that around 1660, 1700 is when modern racism occurred. And so what was Christianity prior to modern racism? So let me just say a couple of things. One is that there were Europeans learning Ethiopian languages, especially gays, from Ethiopians in places like Rome and other places in Europe in the 1500s. Why were they learning it? They wanted to learn the Ethiopian Bible, to read the Ethiopian Bible. Why did they want to read it? Because they knew there were more books in that Bible than any other books.
Let me pause quick. When he said gays, he wasn't referring to a people group or a sexual group. And I think he actually mispronounced it. It's geese. It's an ancient Ethiopian language, one of the first languages in East Africa. So Ge'ez. The Greeks and the Romans were learning Ge'ez so they could translate the Ethiopian Bible.
And they were trying to figure out, is there some knowledge that has been lost that Christians and Ethiopians had retained? But not only did they try to learn the language, and this is all the way up to the 1600s that they're seeking to do that. Not only that, but they are also looking to Ethiopia, especially the Catholics and the Protestants, to try to find a way of renewing the church, just on the Protestant side. So some of you already know the fact that there's a person by the name of Michael the Deacon who meets Martin Luther not in Ethiopia, but this brother travels to Germany, to Wittenberg, to meet Martin Luther in his own home place where he's living and working. And Luther wants to interview him because he wants to learn, is, in my language, Ethiopian Christianity a forerunner of Protestantism? He wants to know, is the Bible in the vernacular and not in Latin? And the brother say, yes, it is. He wants to know, do they have communion of bread and wine, which the Catholics don't allow at that time? And he said, yes, it does. He says, are the priests married in Ethiopia? He said, yes, they are. And he goes down, is purgatory part of your teaching? He says, no, it's not. Do you recognize the supremacy of the Pope? He says, no, we don't. And so he realized that Martin Luther, then, my argument, is using Ethiopia as a place to give an historical precedence to the biblical argument. Because the Catholics said, you're making this up. This is all in your head. And he's saying, no, all you need to do is look at the church in Ethiopia, the church in Egypt, the church in Greece, and you'll find out that there's a historicity that's there. And I'll end with this. Not only does Martin Luther meet with him, not only is he interviewed, but Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon write letters of recommendation. I really think it's more than that, but let's just say it's all it is. And those letters are sent throughout Europe saying, when this brother arrives, treat him as if he is somebody that you need to respect, because he is.
Wow, that's awesome. That's awesome. In light of that, like for some people, a lot of this is new information, and a lot of that has to do with iconography and what we're presented with. And so the answer to whitewashing isn't blackwashing, but what we're saying is we need to present a full narrative. But I want to ask this, anyone can take this one first. As it relates to imagery and even revisionist history, why is Northern Africa viewed or presented as Southern Europe? Did you catch that? Why is Northern Africa presented as Southern Europe?
One of the things, and I think this goes into what happens in biblical studies, and people need to understand how blackness gets defined in North America versus what happens in the actual academy. And this gets to the thing that you're talking about. So in America, we all know they had this thing called a one-drop rule. So if you have one drop of black blood, you're black. So if you got pulled over by the police in 1930, you couldn't say, I'm mostly white, can I mostly not get hit upside the head? You were oppressed, right? Now, when we then flipped over, and this is in all the literature, and they're looking for the black presence in the Bible. This is the question he got to earlier. The standards flipped. So just think about this. In America, if you get pulled over, one drop, you're black. But then who's black in the Bible? Well, then the only black people in the Bible are people who look like me, that's like dark black folks. And so you had this high standard of, in order to be considered black in Bible times, you had to be Ethiopian. But if you're in America, you had to be one drop. And so what happens is, and the reason that even Northern Africa, which has a lot of Berber and lighter black people, those people were kind of raised up effectively into whiteness, or the fact that they had any color was eliminated, while at the same time having a totally different standard of blackness in America. And so what biblical scholars did in the 60s and the 70s, which people say was trite, but it was important. We said, okay, then let's take that definition of black and say, well, then if you use that definition, how many black people are in the Bible? So in other words, if those people who were in the Old and New Testament were pulled over by the police in Alabama, what would you have called them? And if you ask it that way, you get loads of black people. And so that's what you've seen, at least as a movement in biblical studies, of how we began to talk about that. And so people get mad around saying that we're playing fast and loose with the black game. But even if you go back and read the early literature, people like Cope are saying, I'm going to use this definition, because you end up with mostly Afro-Asiatic peoples of some form in that region of the country, in that region of the world during that time period.
Dr. Bantu?
Yeah, definitely. I would definitely agree that like the way that we talk about race and categorize race today is very different than like the even the medieval period or the ancient period and all that. I mean, to add to that, I would say, and Denise Buell points this out in her book, Why This New Race, looking at the function of race in early Christianity, that we don't even have a uniform way of talking about race in the world today. It's not like we even have one. I mean, I'm biracial. So I'm one thing in the US, like Esau said, I'm black in the US, but I go to South Africa, I'm colored. And then I go to West Africa and they're like, oh, you look white. And so it's not even like we have a uniform one today. And it was the same thing back then. And so the kind of like what Esau was saying, definitely North Africans were able to participate in Romanitas, or they were part of the Roman Empire. I mean, North Africa, Egypt were civilizations that existed long before the Roman Empire, but then they were all colonized right before or around the time of the emergence of Christianity. So when Christianity comes around, Egyptians, North Africans, they're all Roman citizens. But they're clearly not white by modern standards. But the tricky thing is that they were white by ancient standards. And like Esau was saying back then, a black person would have been seen as an Ethiopios, which is a racial term. It's not an ethnic term. Ethiopios just means black person, and it would get used to refer to people from South India, South Arabia, actual Ethiopia, Nubia. It was just it meant black. That's all it meant. And so we really should translate the word Ethiopios as black, because that's what they meant. And that did not include Egyptians, North Africans. In fact, Egyptians and North Africans often use that term in a denigrating way. And they would often, you look at their sayings of the Desert Fathers, and Moses the Black, Moses the Ethiopios, who was an Egyptian monk in the 300s and lived among Egyptian monks, and yet they clearly distinguished him from the rest of them, and they even looked down on him, and he even looked down on himself, and he called himself an ash-skinned, burnt-faced one. And then you have all other kinds of North African people who are looking down on that, and they're attempting to play into Roman culture, Greek and Latin language. And you have people like Augustine and Origen that highly look up to European and Roman concepts. And Origen actually, even in his commentary on Song of Songs, even calls blackness a marker of sinfulness. So they were deeply racist, North African, Egyptian, North African people, and they are today too. I mean, let's just be real. If you there's clear, deep race issues in North Africa today where people are more brown skinned. And so I would say that's a large part of why it got seen that way, because at that time, kind of to Pastor Allen's point, in that time also, who were the white people that we now call white? They were the barbarians. They were the people that lived up in Northern and Western Europe. So people on both sides of the Mediterranean were around the same complexion, whether they were in Southern Europe, like now you got Greek and Southern Italians today, they're kind of olive and brown skin. And people in Northern Africa, they would all consider themselves white in comparison to the black people south of there. And the white people to the north of them, they called them barbarians. But when the Roman Empire falls and power shifts to Western and Northern Europe in the Holy Roman Empire and in the Crusades, now whiteness has an even higher standard. And the people who in Roman times would have considered themselves white, which to Esau's point, today we would not have ever considered them white. Athanasius, Augustine, any of those people, if they've been driving around in Southern Alabama in the 50s, they would have been considered black. But in ancient times, they were considered white. But then whiteness gains a new form and a new face in the medieval period.
Wow. Did you want to address that, Dr. Dames?
I was good, but one of the things that happens in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s is that something is uncanny. And the uncanniness is that the division is not based on skin color. The division often is based on whether you're a Christian or Muslim or Jew or not a monotheistic religion. And so therefore, the part that I can't understand, that's why I describe it before the rise of modern racism. Why in this period are there 4 people who are dark-skinned African descent who are consecrated as bishops in the Roman Catholic Church? 2 in the 1500s and 2 in the 1600s, when you won't see that again for the most part until you get to 20th century. I say the rise of modern racism. Why do you have in Portugal, which is the places that is the most receptive, recognizing a distinction between Africans of noble descent, especially Congolese, and then commoners? Commoners are the ones that are enslaved. Those of nobility are the ones that are welcome into the colleges and universities in Portugal at that time. They are able to become, a few of them become professors. Some of them, like Juan Latinos, recognized as a distinguished poet. Others of them are part of the Council of Trent, the famous Roman Catholic council that leads to what becomes the Catholic Reformation. You also have the fact that right next to St. Peter's Basilica is St. Stephen's Chapel that allows for the Ethiopians to have their liturgy engaged. All these things that we won't see during the rise of modern racism, where color will become the distinction, where black will become the name of the slave. There are Indians in India that are enslaved. There's Europeans in Eastern Europe are enslaved, but black will become the color of enslavement, in my argument, with the rise of modern racism. So I think the challenge for me is, what did Christianity look like prior to modern racism, so that we can better understand how we are so shaped by race today that we can't see race even when it's not there.
Dr. Waller, would you like to address that?
No, I'm good.
Well, so for people following us, there are two things I heard. As remember, the question is, why is Northern Africa viewed as Southern Europe? And we heard two R's: revisionist history. So we've made these African fathers and mothers and martyrs from black to white in our imagery, but then also a rejection of the Imago Dei in them, and essentially racism. So maybe that's three R's. I want to do a follow-up on that. What was the method of the whitewashing of Christianity? So we mentioned, well, three here, three R's, but what was the method to get us to this point? Because again, it does have evangelistic effects. People are rejecting Christ as a result of misinformation presented as fact.
I think that sometimes we get mad, and hear me to the, like, I'll say this. We sometimes get upset when we see white depictions of Jesus. And what we need to understand is that in every single culture into which Christianity goes, China, Japan, Sub-Saharan Africa, they all make Jesus to look like them. That is part of what it means to be art. You want God who looks like you. The difference is the Ethiopian Jesus or the Japanese Jesus didn't go and colonize people and then plant that Jesus in front of colonized people. So in other words, like, the Ethiopian Jesus is still in Ethiopia. He's not running around everywhere else. And so what happened then?
Yeah, the white Jesus was on good time.
White Jesus was everywhere. Right? So what happens is now you have yourself in a context in which there are black people with a blonde and blue-eyed Jesus. And then in our context, it goes into film. And then everybody in Egypt is white. And then, like, most everybody. And so you get this place where people then get conscious and they say, well, biblical scholars do the exact same thing. They effectively make the standards for having black characters in the Bible, in the scholarship, really high. And then you have this place where black people are running around trying to find themselves in biblical text and trying to recover our history. And so part of it is the impact of colonialization, not just those depictions. Because, like, you can go, in my house, we had black Jesus and white Jesus on the same wall. And we never even tried to reconcile them. It was my mom's way of trying to balance those things out. But I don't think the instinct of, like, a guy in Italy to paint Jesus looking Italian was bad. It's the fact that that guy then went and colonized people and then said that this God who you're looking at is the one who told me to do it.
Yeah, just to build off of that, I would say he.
All right, I think I'm gonna stop it there. But let me just note, this is some great dialogue. It's interesting. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the greatest African American writers during the Harlem Renaissance period, he talks about a lot of internal battles and internal things, and he's a very smart individual, very profound writer. But even he is stumbled upon the gospel as a result of this white Jesus effect, as a result of this whitewashing of history, as a result of this falsehood projected as truth. And he rejects the gospel. He rejects it as a slave master's religion, as it colonizes religion. And W.E.B. Du Bois is regarded one of the greatest writers ever, especially in the African American community. And if he's taken that stance, imagine how many others stumbled as a result of a lie projected as the truth during the 14 to 1700s as it relates to biblical history. When we know in the one of the greatest time periods of Christian truth finding in the Protestant Reformation, you have Martin Luther relying on the customs of an African man to help resolve the internal conflict of the Christian customs at that time. before most Europeans even immigrated to the United States or America. So think about the foundation of what we are looking at as American Christians. American Christians. You know what I mean? To me, if you're a Christian, you're a Christian. If you follow Jesus, you follow Jesus. You cannot put your American citizenship above that your citizenship in the kingdom of Christ. To me, that's idolatry, and that's that's a bed of deceit. It's a world of deceit that you can build more lies on top of if you are not careful. And these four brothers are articulating that brilliantly. Because in my own kind of rekindling of faith, what brought me to it was injustice. When I look, especially during the height of George Floyd, we see a black man, we see racial tensions at an all-time high, and it's been building up for years through other senseless killings and other injustice. And you make the connection of slavery to Jim Crow to where we are now, and all throughout that time period, Christianity is the main religion of the oppressors. So think about that. Even though I grew up in the church, I'm having to wrestle with that, and I'm having to fight injustice and want to, help educate the next generation as far as Black history, while also fighting the notion of my religion is a key reason why we are so ingrained in our ways and so lost, because our oppressors used Christianity as their twisted version of it, as their religion at a time of great oppression while they were oppressing. So when we talk about Black history begins in the Bible. We cannot get that twisted. And in the Bible, it says people will come and people will twist my religion and add things to it. They will twist my words, take things out, add things to it. The Bible itself tells that. So if the slave masters and the colonizers had actually read the Bible instead of going by just what the Pope says or what the Romans say, the Catholic priests say as truth, they would have realized what they're doing are wrong. But they didn't fully read the Bible and understand the historical context. So much of what's been going on as far as it regards to African American oppression on the backbone of Christianity was built on religious lies, was built on theological ignorance. And I'm glad that these brothers are really diving deep into that. So we have to re-emphasize Black history begins in the Bible. They don't want you to know that. They do not want you to know that. And it's by design. So be careful. I'm going to keep posting content and reacting to content by the Jude 3 Project. Great organization. Awesome content. And check out their website. There's a lot of resources that I'm still diving into and learning more about, that dive into more of the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible, Congolese Christians, West African Christianity before the transatlantic slave trade. Before. So let us not be naive. Let us have a questioning spirit as it relates to what others tell us about the Bible, and let us first dive into the book for ourselves with the understanding of the fact that the job's been finished. Jesus died on the cross, rose again, and anything outside of that we must learn and we must gather and meditate on and pray about, because there's a lot of lies out there, and the Bible itself warns us about that. So with that said, I'm gonna stop it there. It's been your boy Coffee Kid with another episode of The Observation. If y'all enjoyed this content, found it insightful, disagreed, agreed, please leave a comment. I'll definitely respond. Would be much appreciated if you also like and subscribe, turn on post notifications so you can see more content like this right when I throw it up on YouTube. But without further ado, I appreciate if you made it this far, and have a blessed week. Peace.